It began with a question that every Allied commander feared to ask. How do you fuel an invasion across an ocean, without letting the enemy know? The answer would lead to one of the most ambitious, secretive, and technically complex operations of World War II. By 1942, British intelligence estimated that an invasion of Western Europe would require at least 1 million gallons of fuel a day just to keep the tanks and transport vehicles moving. The Allied strategy hinged not only on manpower and firepower, but on gasoline. Without it, D-Day would never leave the beaches. The problem was deadly simple. To transport fuel, the Allies needed tankers. But the English Channel was crawling with the most feared hunters of the sea, German U-boats, operating in wolf packs under experienced commanders like Admiral Karl Donitz. Shipping losses were escalating, and the British Admiralty knew that any large-scale fuel convoy would be detected and sunk within hours. One internal memo, later declassified, read, "Fuel will not reach France by ship. Not by storm, not by stealth, and certainly not by luck." To solve the problem, the Petroleum Warfare Department, PWD, in London was tasked with creating a new method of fuel delivery. One that bypassed the surface entirely. In early 1942, engineer Sir Donald Banks proposed a radical idea. Lay oil pipelines under the ocean. It sounded impossible. The English Channel was 70 miles wide, rough in weather, and under constant German aerial surveillance. Even Churchill himself reportedly called it a plan worthy of a madman. But he approved it. The operation was given a code name that disguised its true nature: Pluto, pipelines under the ocean. The first challenge came from physics. Standard oil pipelines were rigid and fragile, unsuitable for deep-sea pressure. Researchers experimented on the Isle of Wight and in secret facilities across southern England. Two designs emerged: HAIS, a flexible cable-based pipeline modeled after submarine telegraph cables, and HAML, a rigid design reinforced with steel. Testing involved modified naval ships dragging prototypes across British coastal waters while engineers watched for failures. They didn't have to wait long. Pipes ruptured, joints cracked, and sections disappeared before recovery teams reached them. One naval report from May 1943 described a strange incident. A segment of HAIS pipeline being tested off the Isle of Wight vanished overnight. No storm was recorded, and coastal lookouts reported no vessel in the area. When the engineering division checked workshop inventories the next day, several specialized components were missing. The incident was marked as unexplained. Some whispered of sabotage. Others believed the pressure of wartime secrecy was leading to paranoia. But the files remained. And some were quietly classified. Still, progress continued. The Royal Navy began training crews in stealth maritime operations using converted vessels like HMS Holdfast and HMS Latimer, which were disguised as ordinary cable-laying ships. These vessels rehearsed nighttime maneuvers without lighting, guided only by compass and silent radio codes. Every test felt like a rehearsal for a mission that seemed half science and half gamble. As one naval officer later recalled, "We were attempting to stitch a vein across the sea, one that had to survive a war." Amid challenges, inspiration drove innovation. The British government drew on expertise from Siemens Brothers and Company, Callender's Cables, and the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. Teams worked around the clock, often sleeping in their workshops. A fragment from a diary found decades later in a Southampton warehouse reads, "The fuel must flow. Men are dying for lack of it. Failure is not an option we can afford." The urgency of Operation Pluto was not just strategic, it was personal. The Allies knew that success would mean liberation, and failure could cost the invasion. To keep the project hidden, paperwork was fragmented. Diagrams were hand-carried rather than mailed. Technicians involved in one phase were rarely told about the others. Even the final destination of the pipeline remained classified to most of the workforce. To the outside world, these men were simply working on cable trials. Few knew they were building a lifeline for an invasion that would change the war. By the end of 1943, the plan was nearly ready. The channel had been mapped, the technology refined, and the ships prepared. But questions remained unanswered. How much could the Germans see? How much did they suspect? And crucially, the unexplained vanishing equipment still had no official explanation. Operation Pluto would soon move from theory to the open sea. And in the shadows of victory, the first traces of mystery had already begun. The early tests of Operation Pluto would not begin on the battlefield, but in secrecy, along quiet British coastlines where engineers worked under the constant threat of detection. The Isle of Wight became one of the most critical testing grounds. It was close to mainland facilities, yet isolated enough to keep prying eyes at bay. Here, in 1943, the first prototypes were lowered into the sea, though officially, nothing more than electrical cable trials were underway. Only top officials knew that these cables were meant to carry not signals, but fuel. 2 pipeline types were tested. The first, the flexible HAIS pipeline, designed in collaboration with the British cable company Siemens Brothers, looked deceptively simple. It was built around a lead core, reinforced with layers of steel and waterproof materials. The second, the Hamel pipeline, was made of rigid steel, assembled in 20-foot sections. Each had advantages, yet both had critical weaknesses. Deep sea pressure and constant movement threatened to tear them apart. If any pipeline failed during wartime, it could delay the invasion, or worse, expose its secret to German intelligence. The Royal Navy converted several ships for the mission, including the cable ship HMS Holdfast and the repurposed trawler HMS Latimer. These vessels practiced nighttime runs with zero lighting, navigating by compass and silent radio signals. One officer described the tension in his diary. "The sea is the color of ink. We lay the line as if we are writing something secret upon the water. God help us if someone reads it." Every exercise felt like the final rehearsal before a performance no one could afford to get wrong. Early results were promising, until failures began to appear. On April 11, 1943, a 30-mile stretch of HAIS cable lost pressure during testing. Divers sent to locate the fault found a clean severing of the pipe. But no tool marks were visible. No storm had passed. No ships were sighted in the area. The incident was marked inconclusive. The pipeline had simply been cut by something unseen. It was noted, filed, and quietly sealed. Then came another unexplained setback. On the mainland, equipment inventories no longer matched records. Several specialized components, custom-designed couplings used only for the undersea prototypes, disappeared from a workshop in Southampton. The local military police opened an inquiry, but no arrests were made, and the files themselves vanished later that year. Some believed German spies had infiltrated the supply chain. Others suspected bureaucratic chaos. Whatever the truth, suspicions lingered but were never confirmed. Still, the tests continued with urgency. At a meeting in London, engineer Sir Donald Banks defended the project, telling Churchill's representatives that pipelines would be invisible, unassailable, and unstoppable. His words were bold, but the numbers were not. The failure rate of early trials was nearly 40%, and every setback added pressure. Historian accounts describe Churchill himself asking Banks directly, "Can you deliver fuel across the sea?" Banks' response: "We must. The war may depend on it." To strengthen security, the Admiralty began using code-name protocols. The 2 pipeline routes were ordered to be referred to only as Bambi and Dumbo, named after Disney characters to disarm suspicion. Engineers outside the core team never heard the words pipeline or fuel. They were working on marine cables. Some never learned the truth until after the war. By late 1943, the men assembled on the Isle of Wight knew the stakes. Many had seen the devastation of the shipping lanes, photos of tankers split in half, black columns of smoke rising from burned fuel supplies. The English Channel was no longer water. It was a battlefield, and Pluto was a weapon meant to bypass it entirely. One handwritten letter from a naval technician, never sent, perhaps said it best: "We are building a vein to feed an army. If we fail, the heart will stop beating before it reaches France." Yet behind the determination lay a growing unease. Not all tests were successful. Not all tools were accounted for. Some documents never resurfaced. And as the Allies made preparations for the greatest invasion in modern history, the question remained: had anyone else already discovered their plan? The answer would emerge during the next phase of Pluto, when theory would meet real war, and secrecy would confront the open sea. By mid-1944, the time for practice had ended. The Allied invasion of Europe, known as Operation Overlord, was only weeks away, and the pressure to finalize Operation Pluto had reached its breaking point. On June 6, 1944, the beaches of Normandy erupted under the largest amphibious assault in history. Yet while the world watched the landings, another battle was being fought behind the scenes, a race to lay the lifeline that would fuel the invasion. This was no longer an experiment. Pluto had to work. The pipelines, codenamed Bambi and Dumbo, were prepared for deployment. Bambi would stretch 70 miles from the Isle of Wight to Cherbourg, while Dumbo ran just over 30 miles from Dungeness to Boulogne. Crews aboard specially converted ships began the operation under a shroud of secrecy. The HMS Sancroft, HMS Latimer, and HMS Holdfast sailed disguised as civilian cable vessels, their decks loaded with enormous cable drums codenamed conundrums. These steel drums, 30 feet high, slowly unwound the pipeline into the sea, an engineering gamble carried out under constant threat from German reconnaissance aircraft. Laying the pipeline was nothing short of a tactical ballet. The ships could not deviate from course. They could not stop. If a drum jammed, the pipe could snap and send millions of pounds of equipment to the seafloor. To maintain secrecy, no escort ships were used. They sailed alone, unprotected. A naval log describes one nighttime deployment. We are casting steel veins across the sea while hoping the enemy is looking the other way. Despite storms and constant tension, the first major victory arrived on August 22, 1944, when fuel began to flow from the Isle of Wight to Cherbourg. It was a quiet moment, almost anticlimactic. No cheering, no speeches, just the distant hum of machinery and a gauge needle slowly rising. Operation Pluto had worked. For the first time in history, fuel had crossed an ocean through a secret pipeline. But even in success, trouble followed. Initially expected to deliver 150,000 gallons per day, the pipeline struggled at just half that volume. Engineers reported pressure drops at multiple points, and a few minor leaks were recovered near the French coast. One detailed report from a Royal Engineers unit noted an unusual issue. Several pressure gauges were registering inconsistent readings, indicating a possible interference, yet follow-up teams found nothing. The anomaly was logged and quietly dismissed. The Allies continued advancing inland, capturing towns across Normandy. Yet with every mile gained, the pipelines were strained further. The push toward Paris and then Belgium demanded faster fuel delivery, but Pluto could only serve the front lines when they were near the coast. Trucks and portable fuel stations soon supplemented the supply. Still, Pluto held the line long enough to matter. It helped sustain the beachhead, and that bought time. One revealing moment came during a field briefing in September 1944. An American logistics officer stated plainly, "The men think they won the beach battle with rifles and tanks. They didn't. They won it with fuel, and most of it flowed under the sea." The sentiment resonated through Allied command, but the public knew nothing. Pluto would remain invisible, undocumented, and silent. However, one peculiar incident left investigators puzzled. A section of the pipeline off Cherbourg was discovered severed, yet the cut was too smooth for natural failure and too clean for explosives. No tool marks were found. No enemy divers were spotted. The cause was labeled unidentified mechanical failure, but internally, concerns were raised. Had the Germans learned about Pluto? And if so, how much did they know? The pipelines were repaired, but suspicions remained sealed within classified reports. No arrests were made, and no proof of sabotage surfaced. Yet the timing of the damage, only days after fuel began flowing, led some to believe that the leak was not just mechanical. It felt like a warning. as if someone on the other side knew and was watching. Still, the mission pressed onward. Pluto's pipelines continued to operate as units from the U.S. First Army and British Second Army advanced eastward. Every day that fuel flowed, the war in Europe moved forward. As historian Max Hastings later wrote, the war was not only won by courage. It was won by logistics. And logistics ran on fuel. But for the men behind Operation Pluto, one question remained quietly unanswered. If fuel could move unseen across the sea, who else might be moving unseen with it? The next challenge would reveal just how far the limits of Operation Pluto could be pushed, and whether its secrets were truly safe. By late 1944, Operation Pluto had already proven its worth. The Normandy landings had succeeded, the Allies were pushing inland, and the fuel supply, though strained, was still reaching the front lines. But as the armies advanced deeper into France and Belgium, the pipeline that had once been a lifeline began to lag behind. What had started as a cutting-edge secret weapon now faced an unexpected enemy: distance. Pluto's pipelines were never meant to chase the battlefield. They were designed to support the early phase of invasion, when units like the U.S. First Army and the British Second Army operated close to the coast. But as the Allies advanced rapidly toward Paris, then further east, the logistics network needed to evolve. Over 500 miles of pipeline would eventually be laid across land and sea, forming a fuel web stretching from southern England to the outskirts of Belgium. Yet each new mile increased vulnerability. Every joint, every pump station, every measurement of pressure became a potential target, or a potential mystery. One pipeline extension through Cherbourg passed near abandoned German facilities, structures that Allied soldiers found eerily untouched. In some notes and scrap papers suggested that the Germans had been monitoring Allied supply routes long before D-Day. A report from British Field Security Section 88 noted evidence of logistical surveillance, including diagrams of fuel storage sites and shipping lanes. But some drawings appeared to depict a network that did not yet exist, suggesting the enemy anticipated plans that were still in secrecy. Meanwhile, pressure anomalies began to appear with growing frequency. On November 3, 1944, a Royal Engineers unit detected a severe pressure drop along a stretch just south of Rouen. A repair team was dispatched, but by the time they arrived, no leak was found. Yet strangely, the pressure stabilized without intervention. Logs indicate that the drop lasted precisely 46 minutes. No longer, no shorter. The incident was marked again as unexplained mechanical malfunction, and quietly filed away. Many engineers later admitted they believed someone was watching, or listening. One officer, Captain Frederick Halley of the Royal Army Service Corps, kept his own private records. In them he wrote, "The pipeline is being tested, not by us. The cuts are too clean. The pressure dips too exact. It feels like someone is sending messages through it, not fuel." His notes never became official reports. They were found decades later in a personal trunk, sold at auction. But the war pressed forward, and Operation Pluto adapted. The Allies deployed mobile fuel depots, tanker trucks, and portable jerrycan stations. Convoys protected by the 9th Air Force and RAF Typhoon squadrons supplied the fastest-moving divisions. Pluto was still vital, but it was no longer alone. The fuel battle had shifted from the sea to the roads of northern France. Yet Pluto still mattered, especially to historians. At its peak, Operation Pluto delivered over 1 million gallons of fuel per day. Without that early supply, General Eisenhower later admitted, the beachhead in Normandy might have collapsed. "We would not have reached Paris by September," he wrote. "And we could not have held it." In several post-war assessments, Pluto was labeled as a critical asset. Yet curiously, much of the operation remained nearly erased from official memoirs. And so, questions lingered. Why were so many documents marked classified until 1974? Why were reports on pressure failures and missing equipment sealed? And perhaps most puzzling of all, why were so many sections of the pipeline removed after the war without record of their disposal? Some believed this was nothing more than wartime procedure, burying what was no longer needed. But others, especially in later decades, believed the silence had another meaning. Something unnerving. As if Operation Pluto had proven more than just a military tool. Perhaps it had revealed something about wartime intelligence the public was not meant to know. By early 1945, the Allies had pierced the German border and begun closing in on the Reich. The war was shifting, accelerating, becoming louder with every mile. And in that growing roar, Pluto quietly faded from prominence, receding into shadows once again. But even as it disappeared from headlines, a question remained unanswered. Did Pluto serve its purpose? Or had it merely bought time? The final phase of the war would reveal whether the pipelines had been a triumph, or a costly gamble with consequences not yet understood. As 1944 turned into 1945, the war in Western Europe was racing toward its conclusion. Allied forces had crossed France and were pushing into Belgium and the Netherlands. But the momentum came with a new challenge. The further they moved from the coast, the less useful Operation Pluto became. The very pipelines that had silently fueled the invasion were now falling behind the front line. The war was moving too fast. The Allied advance outpaced the fixed network of underwater fuel lines. What had once been a strategic miracle suddenly seemed outdated. The U.S. Third Army, under General George Patton, often advanced more than 20 miles a day, a speed that pipelines could not match. The solution came in the form of mobile fuel logistics. Truck convoys, some made up of more than 1,000 vehicles at a time, began moving fuel across the continent. These were escorted by RAF Typhoon fighter patrols and the 9th Air Force, which targeted any sign of German ambush. By December 1944, Pluto was still active, but operating well below its anticipated capacity. Maintenance crews reported difficulties keeping pressure consistent as the pipeline system stretched further from the coast. Internal reports from the Royal Engineers noted that pump stations in France required constant attention, with several citing unexplained pressure irregularities across sections south of Lille. Still, the fuel had to move, and the war demanded speed. For mobile armies, the pipeline was too slow. Even so, many commanders believed Pluto had already earned its place in history. It had fed the early months of the invasion, when the beachhead needed everything the Allies could give it. Without Pluto, some argued, the initial momentum after D-Day might have stalled. Yet controversy grew over its cost versus effectiveness. Some considered it wartime genius. Others saw it as a daring idea that never reached its full potential. Military planners, however, were focused on a different concern: security. In early January 1945, an investigation was conducted into a missing report concerning the Cherbourg pressure event, a pipeline failure initially believed to be sabotage. The document, which included sketches of the suspected damage and statements from Royal Engineers personnel, was never recovered. The archival gap seemed deliberate. Even more curious, traces of the investigation were found in post-war record books, but without references to the incident itself. The event had happened, but the paperwork had vanished. In one surviving note, a fuel officer wrote, "Pluto saved lives. But something about the records doesn't add up." He wasn't alone. A few technicians who remained in France during the pipeline's final months reported instances of interference, though none could be proven. A diary entry from a maintenance operative based outside Cherbourg reads, "Pipes don't cut themselves. Gauges don't move on their own. We are fueling the war, but someone else is watching how we do it." The entry ended there. The author's identity remains uncertain. By February 1945, with the war nearing its finale, the Allied command quietly shifted resources away from Pluto. The battle had become too mobile. The pipelines would remain in use when possible, but fuel convoys now dominated military strategy. The final blow came when Patton famously declared, "My men can fight without food, but not without fuel." Pluto had delivered part of that fuel, but no longer enough. And so, Operation Pluto slowly faded into the background of wartime logistics. It was not officially abandoned, but it was no longer central. What had once been a daring answer to an impossible question now stood as a reminder of how quickly war evolves. Still, a strange silence followed its decline. No public announcements. No celebrations. No clear closure. In the end, it had achieved just enough to matter, and not enough to be mentioned. Yet one final mystery lingered. Not about the pipeline itself, but about the information it carried beyond fuel. Several post-war analysts began asking a question that the wartime files seemed to avoid. Had the pipeline been studied by both sides, not just for transport, but for communication? Had anyone tried to listen through it? If so, it could explain the strange pressure variations and the missing reports. Pluto never fully won the war, but it might have quietly changed how wars would be fought afterward. And as 1945 approached its climax, the final remnants of Pluto's story were already sinking below the surface, both of the sea and history. But the war was not yet over. And neither was the mystery. The last chapter of Pluto's story would come after victory, and it would raise questions that no official answer ever truly resolved. By March 1945, Allied victory was drawing near. The Rhine had been crossed. Remagen Bridge held. German resistance was collapsing city by city. Yet, while armies advanced and nations prepared for peace, Operation Pluto quietly remained in operation. It was still pumping fuel, but its role had shifted from lifeline to footnote. And like many wartime secrets, it would end not with ceremony, but with silence. As the war concluded, teams from the Royal Engineers and U.S. Army Service Forces began dismantling parts of the pipeline. Some pump stations were abandoned in place. Others were erased from maps and aerial records. Portions of the pipeline were salvaged for post-war reconstruction. But there were segments, nearly 60 miles of them, whose final locations were never fully documented. A 1946 logistics inventory noted, materials removed from northern French depots are unaccounted for. No transport records located. It was never followed up. More puzzling were the missing technical files. Wartime notes about pipeline failures, especially the unexplained pressure drops, were sealed, restricted, or in some cases, absent altogether. Declassification requests in the 1970s surfaced only fragments, incomplete diagrams, partial test results, and vague mentions of probable sabotage concerns. But none of the original investigative reports were ever found. Even U.S. intelligence units that had shared research with the British during 1944 reported that certain Pluto documents were unrecoverable. The secrecy prompted questions, some tactical, some philosophical. Had the Allies discovered something during Pluto's operation that they considered too advanced, or too risky, to disclose? Was there fear that another nation might replicate, or exploit, the pipeline technology? Or had there indeed been enemy infiltration in 1944 that could never be proved? The few who spoke on the matter after the war remained cryptic. One former Royal Navy officer, interviewed in 1963, stated simply, "There are parts of that operation better left under the sea." Still, Pluto's legacy endured. Its technology directly influenced post-war advancements in offshore engineering, underwater communications, and commercial fuel pipelines. What began as a desperate solution to a wartime problem quietly helped shape modern infrastructure. Yet history treated it strangely. Decades passed with only a handful of references in military textbooks. There were no monuments, no medals. For some reason, the story of the pipeline that helped fuel liberation remained overshadowed, almost forgotten. Why? That question persisted. Some historians argue that Pluto's strategic value ended the moment convoys took over. Others believe it was overshadowed by larger victories. D-Day, the liberation of Paris, the Battle of the Bulge. But there is another theory, rarely discussed in official circles. Pluto was too successful at something it was never designed to do. It may have carried fuel, but some think it also carried information, sound, vibrations, patterns, and perhaps, signals. If anyone had attempted to listen through the pipeline, no one would have needed to admit it. In 1978, A retired engineer named Thomas Fellows gave a lecture at Southampton Polytechnic about his experience on Pluto. In it, he remarked, "We created a line the enemy couldn't see, but perhaps they could hear. And if anyone ever figured out how, they never wrote it down." When questioned later, he refused to elaborate. Today, the remnants of Operation Pluto rest on seabeds and in forgotten depots across Britain and France. Some stretches have been recovered. Others remain buried, perhaps forever. What cannot be buried, however, is the question the operation still raises. How many victories depend on inventions the public never learns about? Operation Pluto never fully won the war, but it helped prevent a defeat. And while its physical legacy may have faded, its story remains vital. It is a reminder that behind every battlefield lies a hidden network of innovation, risk, and secrecy. A reminder that wars are not only fought with bullets, but with ideas. And that sometimes, history's greatest achievements disappear in the very moment they succeed. The war ended. The fuel stopped flowing. But the questions stayed. And in the silence after victory, one of WWII's most ambitious secrets began its gradual disappearance into the fog of history.